Now, our next witness is anonymous and will be known as Mrs. A.Q. Let me read out the order in her case. I order that the name and address of witness W0859, that's Mrs. A.Q. to you and me, the name of her late father, and the name of any other member of the witness's family and any other identifying information, such as the witness's image or a description of their appearance, cannot be disclosed or published in any form unless express permission is given by me or by the solicitor to the inquiry acting on my behalf. Witness W0859 must be referred to only as Mrs. A.Q. This order remains in force for the duration of the inquiry and at all times thereafter, unless otherwise ordered, and I may vary or revoke the order by making a further order during the course of the inquiry. Mrs. A.Q., please.
Mrs. A.Q., your name is known to the inquiry. Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth, the whole truth.
Shall be the truth, the whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Mrs. A.Q., you're here to tell us about your late father.
Yes.
And you've provided us with a photograph of him that we're going to put up on the screens in this room, but it is covered by the restriction order and it cannot be used outside of this room. But it will be on the screens for us to see. It's a picture of your dad in France.
Yes.
And we'll keep that photograph up throughout your evidence. You and he had a very close relationship.
Yeah, very, yes.
And you've described him as mild-mannered and easygoing.
Yes, yeah, he was very much so, very kind, very humble. But he had a good sense of humour and I was very close to him. I was an only child, so we had a very close relationship.
He worked at various different engineering firms over the years.
Yes.
In terms of his health before the transfusion that we're going to discuss, what was his health like?
Well, this photograph actually was taken only a year or two before he had the transfusion, and he didn't have any illness or any ongoing illness whatsoever. It was just normal, perfectly healthy.
Your mother kept a diary throughout the time your father was unwell, and you've used those entries to help your understanding of what was happening, because you were quite young at the time.
Yes, at the time of the transfusion I was only 11, and a lot of it, obviously I really remember him being very ill and the hospitalisation and everything, but I didn't remember the dates particularly, or even... it's something in a way I've not been able to speak about, and it sort of goes to the back of your mind, part of it anyway. But so the diaries I've only recently come across because my mum had to go into a care home and we were sorting out her things in a bungalow basically. I didn't realise she'd kept diaries from this far back, but I came across them, yeah.
And they've helped you
They've helped me piece things together. It just started out initially as being a bit of a, curiosity as to when things happened and how, and as you just sort of find out, well, in my case, how bad things were and, that period of time, which being only 11, you don't remember so well.
In 1971, when your dad was about 39, he became unwell. And in March 1971, he was admitted into hospital and found to have a blood clot in the leg.
Yeah, and it was very sudden. There's nothing leading up to that. I mean, one day he just seemed to feel unwell, excruciating pain, and went to see his doctor straight away into hospital.
And he had surgery that day and then a further operation the next day.
Yes.
And you understand that he needed 4 pints of blood.
Yeah, that was written into my mum's diary, so I'm pretty sure on that, yeah.
Having been really quite poorly at that point, he managed to go back to work in the April. But by the June, your mum recorded in her diary that he was unwell again. What was wrong at that point?
We'd started to have cramps in his legs. There was excessive fatigue and tiredness. He was, sometimes I think he'd go to work and end up sort of having to lie down for part of the day at work, which is not like him at all, or excessively tired, lots of aches, stomach pains. My mum describes them as kidney pains, but that just may be her interpretation of the pain he was going through.
You said none of this was taken seriously by the GP.
No.
And it continued throughout June.
Mm.
And then on the day before you went on holiday, on the 9th of July, your father's skin and eyes were very yellow.
Yeah, I've never seen anything like it. So the whites of his eyes were like canary-coloured yellow. It was just... but somehow we still went on holiday. I don't know. He must have been feeling pretty bad, but we went nonetheless.
And then he ended up in hospital while you were away?
Yeah. I mean, there was no disguising. I think we were staying in a guest house or something, but there was no disguising what he looked like. And I guess he went to the hospital to be checked out. And we were straight away put into an isolation ward. My mother and me had to stay and just visit him. But there was no treatment given as such, but that's what happened, yes.
He was transferred after 10 days back to the hospital near your home and then discharged. Did he have any follow-up after that?
No. I mean, the transfer from where we were, which I think was Blackpool, it was on the condition that he went straight, like immediately, not go home. My mother drove back and went straight to the hospital where he'd had most of his, operation and any treatment. So he was taken straight there and admitted virtually straight away.
And then just a few days later, he was discharged home, but there was no follow-up after that?
No, which I remember thinking. I think at the time, why aren't they taking any notice of how he is? Because he was having all sorts of aches and pains as well as the obvious look of him,
Because even once he'd been discharged, you said that your father was still really very poorly for the next few months.
Yes.
What was wrong with him?
Swollen legs, which I think fluid retention, edema, stomach was swollen, was excessively tired. I recall him saying urine was dark, stuff like that, and it's just, the jaundice did, I think the colour went away a little bit, but it was just all aches and pains in his legs and his stomach, really.
In the October of 1971, your dad was readmitted to hospital to have fluid drained and to have liver tests.
Yeah.
And in November, after further tests, what was he told?
He was told that he had inflammation of the liver, and I think by the November they told him it was cirrhosis, which it was a very fast progression of it, but he'd been suffering a lot.
And you think it was around that time that he was diagnosed as having serum hepatitis?
That's what my mum's diary confirms that. That's what they were told, that it was serum hepatitis. And I think at that point, it also records that they were told he must have had a faulty pint of blood. I'm not sure whether that was from a nurse, though, or a consultant, but that's what she recorded, that they were told.
And your understanding then, the serum hepatitis at that time would be what's now called hepatitis B?
Yeah, and I, as you do, look it up, and I've confirmed that, yeah.
But in the diary there is this clear note of being told that he must have had a faulty pint of blood.
Yes.
But no more detail than that.
No, that's yeah. And unfortunately, my mum is not well enough to ask her in more detail.
What were your parents told at that time about the risk of having further children?
I remember, I mean, only being sort of 11, 12 at the time, I remember them discussing together, while my dad was in a hospital bed, something about won't be able to have any more children. And, I mean, being only that young, you don't really take on board, really, what they mean by that. But, you know, I did think to myself, well, I wasn't expecting that maybe they would have any more children, but nevertheless, I think my dad took it quite seriously. I think he kind of thought that it was a big thing to be told that, you know. I had a very close relationship with him, as you know, and I think maybe it was a bit of a blow to him, really. But apart from that, I don't remember anything else about what they were told as such.
You recall that your father continued to be unwell and got worse in 1972, with swelling, cramping, pains in the abdomen, and pains in the leg.
Yeah.
And you have a particular recollection of putting your finger into his leg.
Yeah, and we just press your finger into his leg and just stays sunken in because there's so much fluid there. It's just, you know, remember it just remember that one of those things that I did, and Mark was still there, you know.
Finally, in 1973, he was prescribed prednisolone, a steroid, and you feel that then his health improved and he was quite stable for a number of years at that point.
Yeah. I don't know exactly the date the prednisolone was prescribed. My mum put in the November 71 sort of bit that she wrote, liver tablets. Now, I'm not sure what she meant by that. On at what stage the prednisolone was prescribed, and he seemed to be ill though for still quite a while, up to at least November 73, and then I feel that his condition stabilised somewhat because the diary entries were more not about him being ill then. Yeah.
And that continued through until about November 1981.
Yeah. Well, October, yeah.
And then your father was seen again as an outpatient in a fairly routine appointment.
Yeah.
And the doctor he saw felt he was fit and decided to stop the steroid medication.
Said he was remarkably fit, and they said that if you were on prednisolone or steroids for more than 10 years, there would be side effects. And so he told him that he would take him off the steroids, but they didn't carry on with any other form of treatment or monitor him, as far as I'm aware.
And he came off the steroids very abruptly. There was no tapering of the medication.
No, which I find strange, really, because just more recent years, by complete coincidence, my mother has had the same steroid prescribed for polymyalgia rheumatica, and it was exactly that same prednisolone, and I had to monitor it with her to take her off these steroids very gradually. She was having blood tests every month. We were checking the protein in the sample, and only, you know, taking her, you know, her off these at a very reduced amount.
But for your father, there was also then no monitoring of him or any plan to do anything other than come off the steroids, as far as you know?
No.
4 days later, your father was unwell. What was wrong?
He started having aches all over his body, sort of. Of course, as I say, you look these things up, and I think that maybe the withdrawal of the steroids, at perhaps such a high dose as he may have been on, causes some kind of, I don't know, withdrawal symptoms almost, or it shouldn't be done so abruptly. but he did have lots of aches and pains, lots of feeling generally unwell, started to lose weight quite quickly, I think, and I know that was something he was very concerned about.
And in your mum's diary, throughout the winter, she records your father deteriorating, unable to put weight on, lacking energy, pains in his neck, his stomach, his shoulder, his side, having some cramps and some diarrhoea. And she also records that he went to the doctors very regularly at that point.
He would see his own GP, yes. And I know his concern was, I think he must have probably read up about, you know, the fact that he had such a, he'd been diagnosed with cirrhosis. I think he must have read up that it could have progressed to cancer of the liver at some stage. And I think the fact that he was losing weight so rapidly was a concern to him.
But at that stage, nothing was done about it.
No.
Your father kept working until the June, but then in the June of 1982, he was too unwell to drive to the holiday that your mum and he were going on together.
Yeah.
And that seems to have been quite a marker for him and your mum.
Yes.
Because he would always...
He was the one that drove. My mum didn't really like driving, so, you know, it was a big thing, really, for... She had to support him a bit more, and I think he very much tried to soldier on all the time, tried to not make a big deal of it, tried not to worry either my mum or me, tried to carry on working, but he must have realised how seriously ill he must have been feeling. I think he'd always put his trust before. I think he felt he'd maybe got over a serious stage before, and maybe that would be the case again.
And he kept soldiering on until later in the June when he had a liver scan.
Yeah.
What was he told after that scan?
I still feel in the June they weren't really... They were told there was nothing... I think at that point he was told it was nothing serious, and he may have had gallstones or something, and they may not need to do a liver biopsy then or something, because they didn't really concentrate on his other symptoms. It seemed as if they were just in the dark as to know what to do with him. In fact, I think my mum did record in her diary they don't know what to do with him. But they just kept saying it's nothing serious, you know, which is, I kind of think, what you want to believe, but at the same time you realise it doesn't seem like that. And
then just a few days later, at the very end of June, someone at the hospital mentioned a possible liver transplant.
It was really late on, but, I mean, he was so seriously ill by then. He wasn't sleeping. It was lots of pain. They were giving him painkillers and sleeping tablets, but nothing worked, really. It was, nothing like how he'd been before, only a few months earlier, really.
Your mum's diary records that by then he was practically helpless and really very, very unwell.
Yes.
By this stage, you were getting married in the 1982.
Yeah.
And the night before your wedding, your dad told your mum he wasn't sure that he'd manage the day.
Yeah, I can remember, as I was living with them at the time, the day before the wedding, I could hear something going on. Background noise. I suppose I perhaps was a bit nervous. Wedding day, next day, everything. Got up, they were sitting in the kitchen, and my dad had his head in his hands, and I can remember him saying, I don't know how I'm going to get through tomorrow. Which, you know, we were planning the wedding, and we had considered whether we should postpone it in view of how ill he was. But he was so desperate to be part of it and give me away, and it was a huge thing for him, and he wanted to be part of the day, and with hindsight, we're glad that we carried on with it, because he wouldn't have been able to be part of it, you know, even in the small way that he was in the end.
He did manage to walk you down the aisle?
Just, yeah.
But then couldn't manage to join you after the ceremony? No. You went on to the reception and he and your mum went home.
That's right. He had to sit through the service, but as soon as the service was over, we had to get the wedding car. He was not on any of the photos at the end after the service. So he had to go straight home. And another thing was, the weight he'd lost, the clothes that he was wearing, that he'd only bought something like in the March before the July of the wedding, just hung on him, and people that hadn't seen him, because I did work with people that knew my parents, and they came to the wedding and they were shocked, it had all happened so quickly.
Your dad collapsed 4 days later.
Yeah.
And you were phoned to come home early
Yeah.
from your honeymoon.
Yeah.
And when you went to the hospital, you were told there was a possibility that your father had liver cancer.
It was right at the very end that was mentioned. They'd mentioned all sorts of, well, as I say, they kept saying it's nothing serious. They'd done this, that and the other test, and, as I say, gallstones was something, and some vitamin K deficiency or something, but then the liver cancer was mentioned right at the end. Possibility of a small liver cancer, I think, but,
But that was the first time that
Yeah.
cancer had been mentioned to anyone in the family.
Yes.
Then the doctor said it had spread very quickly, and sadly your father died just 2.5 weeks later.
Yeah, well, it was actually, probably, it was the 23rd. Our wedding day was the 10th, so it was very quickly after we were married,
And on his death certificate, the cause of death was hepatic failure, cirrhosis of the liver, and chronic active hepatitis.
Yes.
Since your father died, you've questioned why he deteriorated so quickly.
Yes.
And you've wondered whether he might have also been infected with something like hepatitis D. But there are no records available to understand what actually happened. But it is a concern for you as to why he deteriorated so quickly.
Well, yes. It was, obviously, and especially with this inquiry, really, you hear other people's stories, and it seemed as if he had an unnaturally quick progression of his illness in the early part of it, to sort of go from a transfusion in March to October, November, when he was told he had cirrhosis, permanent scarring, and very advanced, really. And even just last week, I'd contacted the Hep C Trust just as a bit of general sort of information about hepatitis, and she actually said, a very nice lady, said, I'll have a word with one of the medical people we have on our team, a liver specialist. And he came back with, he agreed it was an unusually fast progression, but he came back with a couple of thoughts, one of which was non-alcoholic related, which usually you have to have some sort of fatty tissue, and he was not overweight, as you can see. Also, he'd not got, she said, did he have any previous liver condition existing? And he definitely didn't have. He wasn't a drinker, he wasn't in any of the high-risk groups that you would perhaps consider may be more susceptible. But then the one thing that I looked into was the fact that he could have been co-infected at the same time with hepatitis D, which relies on hepatitis B to get going and progress, and then it does become quite aggressive. And that, to me, made sense in my mind. I've got no evidence. Unfortunately, my father's medical records are no longer in place. We have tried, but only recently, and it's such a long time ago. My mother really wasn't up to dealing with things earlier on, when we wondered if there'd been such a lot of negligence, and, she just wasn't able to deal with it. So we never sought his records, but
So he had hepatitis B.
we do.
But you're left with questions about why there was such
It's a possibility, and when I look at it, it's a strong possibility, because his symptoms were very fast and aggressive, and I mean, I've looked up, and hepatitis D wasn't really recognised as such until 1977, I believe. Well, that was before my dad would have had all these tests, really.
Your mother has struggled with your father's death.
Yeah.
She was just 48, and you'd left home just a few weeks before he died to get married, and so she was on her own.
Yeah.
And you say in your statement she's been a widow now for 37 years and has never really moved on.
No, she hasn't. It created huge problems for her. I mean, it's fair to say she's devastated. Just about every time I've seen her, she'll talk about how long she's been on her own, how much she misses my dad. I guess he was probably her life and the strong one in the partnership, and she's found it hard to cope. She's been on, she is at the moment on antidepressants. She's had dark thoughts, suicidal thoughts, not wanting to be here anymore. So, yeah, it's affected her in a big way.
Your own children feel you've bottled your grief up as well.
They do, really. I mean, my husband and my children have been brilliant, and there's not many people, hardly anybody, that I've been able to talk to, but I have talked with them, and they do feel that. And because there hasn't been anybody I've talked to very much, it's been quite nice to have the opportunity to come here and talk about it. Yeah, it's just quite hard, really, you know, because I feel, especially because it happened virtually as soon as we were married, I feel my mum needed our support. We weren't really able to have much of a normal time together on our, you know, without that at the back of our mind. I'm not saying I mind, but it's been different. It's not been what you would expect when you're newly married. And my mum, being an only one, and my mum couldn't cope, it was pretty hard to, you know, I felt as if I had to be strong for her and try and get her to try and cope with it as best as she could and try and involve her in things. She wasn't working at the time, but, you know, but it was very hard because she didn't really want to do anything. A lot of the things they did together as a couple. They did, for instance, sequence dancing, which I think she did try to go afterwards, but of course it just reminded her of the fact that she wasn't with my dad anymore, and it just was very hard for her.
You've also felt it quite strongly, now that you've got children of your own, that your dad would have loved to have met his granddaughters.
Oh, completely. He was such a family man. I mean, I remember such happy times with him. He was perfect father for me, and he would have loved the two girls. Both ended up going to university, something I think he would have been like to have done himself, but the situation he was in at the time, the money didn't allow for that. So he would have been extraordinarily proud of that. And I have tried to talk to my daughters about him, and we look at photos, and because I felt it was important they understood why he died so young. He was 49. You know, most of their friends have got grandparents around, and of course they were curious, and it's been good to talk about that, but of course it's sad that he wasn't around.
And you feel quite strongly that he was badly let down,
Yes.
particularly, ironically, because he gave blood very regularly.
Yes. Yeah, ironically, he was a blood donor. He'd been a blood donor for 20 years, and he was very proud of that. Got his badge and the certificate, everything, and yeah, but ironically, he was let down.
And finally, neither your mum nor you have received any financial assistance from anywhere.
No.
Because it's hepatitis B, and there's no provision.
Yeah, and I think as well that is true what you're saying. I felt that my mum wasn't in a stable place to go forward with any trying to get compensation or to even medical negligence, if you like. I think she felt that there was no bringing him back, and every time it was mentioned, I remember even at the time he died, we were almost fobbed off. We'd been called into the hospital to go and see him. Just a few minutes, by the time we got there, it wasn't a long journey, but by the time we got there, he had died. And, even then, I think someone came in and asked if, they could do a post-mortem and all this, that and the other for research purposes on his liver. And my mum was just in pieces. And it was a bit insensitive, to say the least. And it just, I don't think she was in a fit state to go forward with going for compensation. And even then, I think at that point in time, my mum said something about being serum hepatitis, and they said, oh, well, it could have been a virus or something. So it was almost being fobbed off even at that point.
And she wasn't eligible under any of the trusts and schemes because it was hepatitis B?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of, yeah.
Those are the questions I have for you.
Okay.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, I'd just like to say a few words, if that's okay. Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to Sir Brian and the inquiry team for inviting me to speak today. It does mean a lot to finally have a voice, really, on behalf of my dad. I'm so grateful to finally have the opportunity to tell my father's story, especially as he suffered so much with his illness, and also due to the fact that my mother and I felt that we were being fobbed off by doctors and consultants every time that we mentioned that he'd had contracted hepatitis through a blood transfusion. There is no doubt in my mind that the failings of the NHS, starting with the contaminated blood being given, ended my father's life at the early age of 49 years. I want to emphasise the huge impact this has had on my family, particularly for my mother, because it effectively ended her life too, causing her to have severe depression and suicidal thoughts. My father was very humble, gentle and unassuming, but also so full of life and a real family man. He has missed so many things. Seeing his grandchildren would have given both him and them tremendous joy. Plans to go to Paris to celebrate my parents' silver wedding anniversary the following year, in 1983, never happened. And seeing his favourite football team, Leicester City, win the Premier League against all the odds would have been so special to him. We still miss him so much. My father was completely innocent and very trusting of the medical profession until the end. This trust was very much misplaced. Thank you for listening to his story. I sincerely hope that this inquiry succeeds in making everyone know about the injustices of what happened.
Well, thank you for telling your story.
Thank you.
And being so happy to do so, to give your father a voice. You very gently raised questions about the rapid progress of his illness and the puzzles that gave rise to. And I think delicately shone a light on not only his suffering, but the hole that his departure has left behind, particularly in your mother's life, and how the ripple effects just go on. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Ms. Fraser-Butlin, tomorrow?
Tomorrow, the first witness will be anonymous. Then we will hear from Malcolm Slater and Violet Slater. And then the following two witnesses will also be anonymous.
Thank you. 10 o'clock tomorrow. 10 o'clock.